Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'm going to be rereading a short story you might have heard a couple of years ago to add it to the audiobook I'm going to put on YouTube called Mr. Hamburger as part of the series Swamp Castle. Mr. Hamburger by Tom Drake / Rhombus Tix. Mr. Hamburger looked at the ritualistically stacked pile of various copies of his skull and rubbed the back of his head. Subjectively, not more than 30 minutes ago, he'd been eating his lunch, and now not only was his own life on the line, but the fate of millions, all because some idiot he'd never met had taken his picture. He took a deep breath and looked at his advocate. So let me get this straight. Sosuri was human, about 4 feet in height, and nominally Caucasian, but his features were more like a mix of all ethnicities. He wore a simple, flowing, featureless white robe that seemed to ooze and flow in a breeze that Mr. Hamburger couldn't even feel. Sosuri smiled and held Ham's hand. Please go on. I'm dead. But now I'm not dead, and they're going to kill me again. Correct. Sosuri looked very hopeful that Ham was getting the situation. And I'm going to stand trial, and the odds are stacked against me, so I need to trust you completely because we don't have much time. Correct. Sosuri nodded once, but didn't move beyond that. Ham found Sosuri's movements slightly spasmodic and unsettling. Ham put his hand behind his head. He looked at Sosuri and the skulls, and then back at Sosuri, and then back at the skulls. I'm sorry, I just don't believe you. You seem very earnest, but I can't help but think, Sosuri nodded. I completely understand. His voice was sympathetic but wary. I had hoped, letting you do what you wanted the last 6 times you died, that you could learn something that might help convince you. And I'm afraid we've run out of time. Both of Ham's hands came up to his face apologetically. What I am about to do carries risk because the more I do it, the less you are considered you. But I'm willing to take it now because of what will come if we fail. Ham waited expectantly. When Sosuri didn't say anything, Ham moved his hands up and down expectantly. Well? Sosuri looked into Ham's eyes. Ham felt something stir in his bowels that was icy and warm at the same time. It felt very confusing, but his brain didn't care what it reported to his mind. He knew, in the core of his being, that everything that Sosuri was going to say was absolutely, irrevocably true. You really are in the future. Everyone you meet is genetically and cybernetically more intelligent and empathic than you. You are yourself, not a clone. You are just as much yourself as you would be to a degree that you can possibly imagine. That statement makes sense, whether it makes sense or not. Major portions of our society were dedicated towards technology to bring you back to life. Ham felt his mind was opened and the knowledge put inside like the mast of a ship in a bottle. It was disconcerting, and he felt a bit violated. Was violated the right word? His brain had been stirred with a spoon, served up as cookies, and then fed to him for dessert. Violated was probably the right word. Sosuri continued, if you don't win this, then they are going to resurrect more people and kill them again and again if you don't listen to me. Many more people are going to suffer and die. Do you understand? The light in Ham's brain flickered for a moment, and then he felt ill. His stomach heaved, and he felt like he would vomit, but he didn't. Instead, he just knew that absolutely everything Sosuri said was the truth. More than his own life, more than his memories of his family, Sosuri's compulsion started like a seed and began to expand in his entire mind. The defender's face fell, and he gestured Ham towards a seat at a nearby table. Now you understand. You understand too much, I fear, but I think the pain of others will think of the pain that others will feel and suffer if you do not act. Ham had never considered himself the most empathic individual. His parents had complained to him all the time. He'd been fond of using a hammer to kill mice who ate the food storage in the basement, but Ham had figured that he was just protecting their food. However, now it was different. He could picture the pain going through every single life he snuffed out in those cute little beady eyes. He looked into Sorcery's eyes and saw the wisdom of 1,000 years gazing down on him. He thought about it. The memory of the mice just didn't make any sense. Why would his parents have food storage? They weren't Mormon. That was the neighbors next door. Ham rubbed his eyes, trying to reconcile the two. He knew that the memory didn't make sense, but he also knew that he actually really was himself, and that was the more recent compulsion. His first thought was what? He tried to wrap his head around it, but then it sunk inside his brain and then melted away. That was the operative word, compulsion. No. Ham stood up and crossed his arms. No what, precisely? Ham cocked his head in interest. There was a look of even deeper concern in his eyes. No, Ham paused mid-sentence. He couldn't deny the truth of what Ham had told them, but he could not deny the truth of what was self-evident. Is it possible that my memory was hacked? Hacked? Sorcery thought a moment and nodded. Oh, well, certainly it's possible. Your most recent version was the work of Dr. Malgus White, and it has been in use for 200 years. No one has ever thought to check for corruption in your system. That... Sorcery looked into space for a few seconds and nodded. Fantastic. Your observations will gain us more time. Did you just read my mind? Your thoughts have been in the public domain for over 500 years. As a simulated person, you only have rights if you are cleared of charges. Ham shook his head. No, I don't accept this. This isn't justice. The question of who or what a person is, actually, is what this all is all about, Mr. Hamburger. Did you think your era unique? There have been things done with the sciences that you have not been told about and can only begin to imagine. But they start with the most basic tenets. What does it mean to be human, and to whom is true justice to be proffered? And I don't think I have time for long philosophical debate with you, Mr. Hamburger, but let us merely state that ultimately it was decided that it was the temporarily subjective experience rather than the unique biology that constituted an individual. And once that question was decided, it was only a logical step to protect all living species. The more complex the mind, the more protections it deserved, until the great Daniel's equality, which stated that anything with the eukaryotic threshold deserved the chance for advancement at its own pace, even if that meant transcribing death. That is why you need to accept that you are indeed you. Even if you have been hacked, you are Mr. Hamburger, not the biological components that consist of your flesh, and thus it is that you will be tried for your symbolic crimes. Ham uncrossed his arms and tried to scratch his head, but stopped the move and scratched his chin and said, What? Again, I do not have time to discuss 1,000 years of legal theory, but suffice to say that symbology, like all other sciences, have moved forward. You are a living symbol of that which came before, and as such are to be tried within your frame and understanding of justice as to your guilt or innocence. It is a ritual that has gone on for centuries, usually resulting in your death, as it has caused the death of so many others. Only now, the radical Citron faction... Citron? Please stop asking questions, Mr. Hamburger. We don't have time to answer them all. And no, I'm not giving you access to a computer terminal. You will do bad things with it. Just know that the stakes are more than your own miserable life this time. Time passed. Ham was incredulous. His opponent was a talking cow. Okay, bull. Those long, sharpened horns couldn't be misinterpreted, and once he'd seen the look in Craig's eyes, he knew that Craig didn't want to just beat him in court if he could get away with it. Craig would stab Ham in the throat and stomp on the abused corpse, and then resurrect him so he could do the same thing all over again. Craig, the talking cow. The judge was a computer. Apparently everyone regarded digital intelligence as more than just and honest than anyone in the biological persuasion, and felt perfectly comfortable with the safeguards they put in place to ensure that they were now not slaves to robots. Sorcery had practically giggled when he brought up the notion. Motion for mistrial, Your Honor. Craig the talking cow spoke with a crisp voice. He was on all fours, wearing a suit that seemed to match his exact pattern on his skin. He wore a collar which had objects float around him, apparently allowing him to have, quote, hands, end quote. The judge responded, denied. But Hamburger 823 clearly isn't the person he was, Your Honor. Evidence? Craig the Talking Cow said, "His own words, Your Honor. He didn't notice the implanted memories until opposing counsel used a declarative." Ham stood up. "Excuse me." The cow's eyes glowed red. Seriously, the cow's actual eyes glowed an actual shade of red as it stared him down. "Shut up, murderer." "Objection," Sorcery said. "That's alleged murderer." "Sustained." The judge accepted the motion without any emotional inflection whatsoever. "Fine. The alg murderer, the one whose exact duplicate, has been found guilty of murder by approximately 700 out of 718 times previous, has no business flapping its lips in court. Until found to not be murdering filth, there is the presumption of guilt, and we should invoke the child safety protocols. He has lived a life that has harmed multiple species, human, cow, and others, including my ancestors." "Is this really necessary?" Sorcery seemed to object rather half-heartedly as he said it, as if he quietly agreed with Craig the Talking Cow. The judge acquiesced to Craig the Talking Cow. "Very well. Given past historical behavior, including irrational behavior, is likely. Child safety protocols engaged." Ham suddenly found that he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Sorcery shook his head sadly, spreading his hands as if in some sort of supplication. "Has it really come to this? Every year we ritually murder this man purely for the symbology of the crimes perpetrated by others. Mr. Hamburger was a symbol, yes, but he himself did no—" "I am not going to argue basic governmental theory with you. This isn't the Dark Ages, and it isn't elementary school. You know the importance of symbology, and your statements border on Randian heresy. The individual is not an island. Yes, the alg murderer gets a trial, and has occasionally found loopholes. 2 Mr. Hamburgers have even managed to be productive members of society after being upgraded to modern intelligence, but the vast majority of them are barbarians straight out of the American Empire. Do you want to see the highlights again?" The judge didn't have an opinion one way or the other. Sorcery scowled and then shook his head. "That will not be necessary, thank you very much." Motion to miscarry denied. Sorcery looked rather relieved. Craig the Talking Cow was snippy and stormed towards the door, pausing in midstream to whisper in Ham's ear by tipping his frozen body to the floor. It landed in a meaty thud. "Just so you know," Craig whispered, "if the miscarry had gone through, your life might have been saved. Have a nice day, murderer." Ham oomphed in anger, and the judge left. Sorcery started packing his briefcase and was about to leave when the child safety locks on his body lifted. "What the hell?" Sorcery looked at Ham and shook his head. "Typical American. Only concerned with yourself. Is it true?" Sorcery didn't bother giving Ham a response as he walked out the door. Abstractly, well, thanks to Sorcery's pronouncements concretely with a diligent attempt at making it abstract, he knew that if they lost the case, people were going to die. A lot of people. But Ham didn't want to die. He was just a guy who had eaten a hamburger. Time passed. It was the middle of the night. The judge's chamber had shifted through some nano-magic or future tech and turned into his quarters. Same room, just with a totally different lock. He kept talking to the room in hopes it might give him a computer terminal. After the 100th time that he had asked it, something different happened. The room said, "Hamburger 666 through 722 used a terminal to hack and achieve restricted information that would have affected the outcome of the trial." Ham sat down on his cot after that and just stared at the ceiling. He asked the ceiling, "Is there anything you're obliged to tell me if I ask for it? I'm asking for everything." Nothing happened. "I'd like a glass of water." A glass of water rose up to the table in the far corner of his room. "I'd like a magazine." A magazine from Time from the year 1975 rose up to the table. "I'd like a hamburger." The ceiling laughed. Ham shrugged, gave up, and went to sleep. The morning started with fanfare and trumpets. The walls, which had now been featureless and which had up until now been featureless and gray, turned transparent and began to show images from all over the planet, including commentary. He found that just by thinking about one image in general, he focused on something specific. There were parades, processions, and even morning services. He saw several images of himself. "Ah, yes, that's right, Bob. It looks like he's found the feed of himself." It sounded like some kind of newscaster or commentator. "Oh, he's listening to you, Bob." "Well, hello, Mr. Hamburger. How are you today?" Ham waved. He tried to think about what to say and finally coughed into his hand and looked around. In general, good. How does it feel to be on death's door? Surreal. Less than pleasant? Yeah, that makes sense to me. A more soothing voice in the background was making commentary on the conversation. Bob is one of the more recognizable commentators selected by Ham due to his North American accent and 20th century talkhead persona. It's something he can relate to in a world of things he can't relate to. This commentary is selected about 10% of the time. Mr. Hamburger 823 is currently listening to this commentary. He switched it off. Just how many people were watching him? A voice in his head chimed in his head. You've got mail! From whom? You have, he paused, 2 billion messages. He wondered if the voice paused for effect. How many of them hate me? Ham sat down in the corner. 1.96 billion are hostile. The voice sounded almost sympathetic. Hell, it probably was sympathetic. Do any of them have any advice? Bob laughed. Hey there, Mr. Hamburger. Just wanted to remind you I'm still here. I don't think you want to read those. Why? Well, they're mostly from children. Writing you is a bit like what you'd think of as writing to Santa, except they hate you, and they don't expect you to bring them anything. Ham wanted to panic. He wanted to disbelieve all of this, and after a time, he finally just accepted it. Ham was a monster to these people in an impossible world, and he was likely to die, but he wanted to live. Whatever life this was or wasn't, he wanted to live. Whoa, buddy, Bob sounded surprised. Your self-awareness and empathy just went through the roof. You know, rumor has it that on the ether that you're different somehow, that something has been done to you, and that there was a motion for a mistrial yesterday. Care to comment? I can't, on the advice of my attorney. Smart man! The odds in Vegas for your survival just went up another 20%. Can you at least give us a hint? Ham thought a moment. Maybe he could get something useful out of this. I will if you tell me why I'm able to talk to you and see you all of a sudden. Oh, I'll give that to you for free. It's part of the ritual. It doesn't matter as much if you're not exposed to how much and how far the world has come since you ate the hamburger. That probably doesn't make sense, but it will soon enough. So, I can see the world? Well, yes. I mean, that's part of the whole thing, but Ham thought for a moment, disconnect or hang up or whatever. There was a chime, and suddenly Bob was, quote, gone, end quote, even though he'd never really seen him in the first place. Voice, room, or what should I call you? The voice resumed its neutral tone. You may call me anything you like, Ham, but before you explore your parameters and options, you should know that your trial is set to begin soon. How soon? 5 minutes. What? That's not much time. Ham really felt boxed in here. Brevity and speediness is considered a mercy. How, precisely, is hastening my trial a mercy? Ham had just ordered a bowl of apples. He placed it in the room with his mind. He knocked it over, and the apples melted back into the floor just as easily as they had appeared. It is pointless to show you a life and a future you cannot have. It is equally cruel to deny you true intelligence when we have the capacity to grant it. Time was running out, but Ham had began to see a ray of hope in all this. Wait, you're telling me that if I'm found not guilty, I get enhanced intelligence? The voice was bright and helpful sounding. Oh, yes. All the benefits of true full citizenship, including a pardon for all past or perceived crimes, immortality, sustainability credit, though with your celebrity, you are likely to be quite rich. Aha! This might be it. His heart leapt in his chest, but Ham threw the idea out there regardless. Is there any way I can get enhanced intelligence now, and instead act as my own lawyer? The voice clucked sympathetically. Oh dear, I'm afraid you don't understand. Well, duh, hence the need for enhanced intelligence, so please explain. I can't really, but for your sake I will try. Please do. The enhanced intelligence is your trial. Silence filled the room for a moment and kept filling it. What? Most of your predecessors, when faced with the true gravity of their crimes, elected for their right as a citizen to end their life immediately. It is quite painless, I assure you. Wait, what? Ham stood up. This was not going how he'd hoped. Then I do not want enhanced intelligence. I'm afraid you have no choice, Ham. Willful ignorance became illegal 700 years ago, and you cannot be allowed to not know the extent of your crimes. I don't think I want to know the extent of my crimes? Ham did not like this at all. He backed into a wall. Willful ignorance is illegal. There had to be some way out of this, not just for his sake, but for others. This was wrong. Can I end my life early before the intelligence? Legally, at the moment you are a minor, without the minimum intelligence, empathy, and sentience requested for citizenship, you cannot make that kind of a choice, and it anticipated his next question before he asked it. and no counselor of any ethics whatsoever would advocate such a thing. Ham wasn't even sure he wanted to end it. In fact, upon reflection, he wasn't sure he didn't. He hadn't asked for this life, and he hadn't asked people to hate him. He had only eaten a hamburger. He didn't have a lot of choices, but he could at least muster some kind of dignity. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the wall and was about to say, "Hit me." However, as soon as he did, he found that the room had shifted. He hadn't said a thing. It had just responded to his thoughts. Instead of the lounge in which he had spoken to the judge, he stood in a single room with a door and a giant red button in the middle of the room. The knowledge began to pour into his mind. The door was the way out, but it wouldn't open until the trial was over. The button was a physical indicator he wanted to die. To live, all he had to do was not press it. It started with the animals. He felt, firsthand, the pain and suffering of every animal he had ever killed. Ham hadn't realized just how many different animals he had consumed, not just beef, but chicken, turkey, tuna, salmon, deer, mouse, yak, buffalo, ostrich, and all kinds of rats and mice and insects that had died in the industrial processes of the preparations of his non-meat food. He tried to object to this, but to obtain citizenship, he knew he had to know the truth of humanity's past crimes. Every animal was far more intelligent than he would have thought. True, none of them was going to compose a symphony, but they understood life, and they wanted to keep it. They died 1,000 different ways, but the poison was the worst, at least in terms of pain. But for the sheer psychological horror, the searing electrical shock right before he felt his flesh tearing apart was the worst. The input was masterly choreographed. Just as soon as he adjusted to the new wave of pain and disorientation, another death hit him. Physically, he was as fit as when he entered the room, but mentally he was reduced to tears after the first death. By the 100th death, he rolled around on the ground and was ready to press the button. The pain overwhelmed him and sent him to the floor. He stayed there. The self-actuation and psychology that his mind was fed slowly helped him get some sense of self back. For most people, this knowledge, combined with centuries of happy memories collected from people and the sure knowledge that they hadn't done anything, would usually bring them back from the edge of the abyss. For Ham, it gave him enough to pull his hand back for the button just a moment. He wasn't the same as his old self, but he had been made artificially. He was different. And then the sciences that he could not have understood until they were in his head began to sprout and bloom. He was Mr. Hamburger. He was his experiences, and he was guilty because it was his memories that he lived. His creators were not guilty because they had given him every chance, except they hadn't. It was wrong. No matter how much knowledge that poured into his head, he knew on an instinctive level it was wrong. That was when history began to enter his mind. He grabbed his throat, trying to choke the life out of himself. It was too much. He put his hands on his head, trying to keep it out, but of course it did no good that way. All he could do was curl up in a ball and let it slam him again and again. Ham saw images of himself being used as propaganda. He was as well known as Tank Man had been in his day and age, and now Mr. Hamburger was a symbol of those who believe it acceptable to kill and enslave other living creatures. He was the swastika, only without the previously positive history of that other particular image. It didn't matter that he had been innocent from his perspective. In the judgment of history, he was a monster. He was Tokyo Rose. He was Baghdad Bob. He was hacked. He was hacked. He had been hacked. Sure, his memories, and indeed himself, approached 99.999% him by sciences strange and alien and wonderful and arcane. However, there was something new, a unique spark, and each individual had a right to make the world a better place. By trying to hack him, by trying to to tilt the game in their favor, Craig the talking cow had lost. Ham got up and opened the door. He could feel the anger of the cows building to a crescendo as he stepped outside. The chickens thought it was funny, and the tuna thought it was sad. The dolphins were with the chickens, but the dolphins had the best sense of humor in the world. Chickens were simply the routine brunt of all their jokes, and everyone else's jokes, really. The doors didn't swing open so much as the fact that it swam through him. he found himself standing in a room with sorcery and the judge present. It was that easy? Sorcery put his hand on his gut and laughed. Did you call that easy? No one here could have done that. You're a hero, Ham 823. Even though you don't know it, because of you, while resurrections will take place, they will be judged by their own times and slowly brought online with the rest of us as an individual program, rather than one that will ensure their own death. 2 questions immediately occurred to him, then a third, then a million more. How? What's such a big deal about realizing I was different? The motion at the beginning of your trial were the most I could obtain. Many others haven't been able to get that much. The reasons are complex, more complex than even now with the citizenship you can understand, but basically it was rage. Despite all that, we have grown, and we helped others grow. Just the same, rage and fear are still quite prominent in our species, and in those who choose to emulate us, like cows. Though don't ever tell a cow that. It's horribly racist. So sorry, and the judge shared a private laugh. Ham could feel something in the back of his mind inputting the information he wanted. Complex factional politics and interspecies relationships, and then it hit him. Zach. My name is Zach Mason. Your name, Zach Mason, is whatever you choose it to be. Zach Mason is simply the name that your previous self thought himself to be. Why, oh, never mind, he sighed. Of course it was going to be complicated. So now that you are citizen Zach Mason 823, what do you want to do first? His first thought, honestly, was that he wanted a hamburger. He fought down a nervous laugh. Now that he was a citizen, he had privacy protocols in place. Let me think about that. So, that is probably my second favorite story of all the ones that are going to be in this series after Waiting for the Monsters to Die. And frankly, this story is a lot more fun. Zach is more of an anti-hero than a hero. His only real choice is self-realization. But, I'll be honest, in a day and age where fascism is on the march and people are willfully ignorant about destroying this planet and how much we're hurting not just ourselves or future generations, but every species on this planet and the future born or not born. You see people talk about unborn children, but they don't seem to care about the life of those unborn children when they try and ruin the planet as much as possible. And this story for me was largely written about worry about what future generations might think, right? In our day and age, I see people judge people in the past for standards that they couldn't have known, right? Feminism is a very recent understanding, and a white cis hetero man raised in the 19th century was raised to think that women were property. Now, and that in certain cases that slavery was legal. Now, in certain cases, it should be self-evident that owning another human being is wrong. And a lot of people raised in those circumstances did come to the realization that women should be equal or treated like human beings, or at least better than they were, which is part of the reason we even had any progress in the first place, and part of the reason slavery was eventually declared illegal. But the fact of the matter is, I think sometimes we're too quick to judge people in the past. I am a firm believer in objective truth. I believe that such a thing exists, even if we may never actually know what the objective truth is, and I think it's worth pursuing. But I think that we need to also understand subjective truth, and that somebody raised in a society that we judge, in certain cases entirely correctly, evil, can't be held to the same standard as somebody who lives in our own society and who decides to still think that women are property, or that slavery is just fine, or that we should ignore the past and cover it up. At the same time, there's no doubt in my mind that ritualistically recreating someone, even if you don't like, whether it's Hitler or something else like that, and killing them on an annual basis is, quite frankly, barbaric. And again, that's kind of the point of the story, right? You have this society where they are beyond causing pain to anything else, but then have this ritualistic, almost animalistic need to cause pain and fight the past. And I will also be honest, I suspect that future generations will not look back on this particular part of history kindly, right? They're going to have to clean up a mess with a world that's falling apart. And unless we get incredibly lucky, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I do actually sincerely believe that it is going to be better. I do think that a world where we have faster than light travel and clean power and a utopian society and a post-scarcity society is not only possible, but probable. But I think that it's going to be a lot of work to get there. And we're going to resent people. Well, they're going to resent people who made poor choices. And the more poor choices you made, the more they're going to be resenting you. I think at some point, the idea of inherited wealth for people who have chosen to ignore the obvious at this point will be exempt. I don't think you're going to get to inherit $1 billion when you're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or people who basically deliberately cause wanton suffering and pretend to ignore it when they are warned. We know that these people know better. By the way, full disclosure, I do eat meat. The only thing that changed after I wrote this story is that I genuinely try to avoid eating meat that's caused by deliberate suffering like foie gras or veal. And I try and avoid eating most intelligent species like octopi, although I do eat bacon, and pigs are far more intelligent than you would think. If this story changed your perspective, you might want to reconsider bacon. I did briefly considering bacon and still eat it. Anyway, that was
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!